Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's University Business web seminar, which is entitled Today's Wireless Journey, Duke University Shares Past, Present, and Future of Campus Wireless, which is brought by the generous support of our sponsor, Cisco. Now, before we get started, I would just like to share just a few housekeeping items with you. For technical support, please use the chat panel, which you can find on the right side of your screen, then select on my name, which is Stephen Blackburn, and then type your message if you're having any technical issues, and I should get to you shortly. If you don't have computer speakers, or maybe you prefer to listen privately, then please dial the phone number and access code that I will be posting in the chat window in a few moments, so look out for that. We will also be welcoming any questions you have today with a Q&A session that will take place at the end of the presentation. To submit a question, please use the Q&A panel, which you can find at the bottom right side of your screen near the chat, and then send your questions to all panelists, which should be the default option. If you don't see the chat or the Q&A panels, just look to the right side of your screen again and click on the expand triangle, which is located directly in front of the panel name to make sure you have access to it. Also, something important to note very quickly, if you would like to have access to this web seminar at a later time, everyone who is registered and is attending today will receive an email with a link to the archive recording. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce to all of you today our panelists. First, our original speaker from Duke University, Bob Johnson. He had a personal emergency that he had to attend to today, but we are honored to have John Robinson, who is the Director of IT in the Office of IT Networking Engineering at Duke University. And we also have Michael Shepard, who is the Sales Business Development Manager at Cisco. Well, great to have you with us today, guys. And without further ado, I will now hand things off to Michael. Take it away.
Hey, Stephen, thank you. I hope you can hear me okay as I've come off mute twice now. So listen, I appreciate everybody's time. And John, special shout out to you for scrambling to backfill given Bob's emergency. So what I want to just start out with is tell us about yourself, John, your role at Duke, so folks understand kind of your jurisdiction and the things that you care about and take care of at the campus.
All right, first of all, I just want to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully I'll be a good fill-in for Bob. So, but if you don't like anything from that, we can always blame Bob in the back end. So that's always good for me. I am currently the Director of Network Engineering for University, and what that means for OIT is my team is responsible for the design, implementation from the core down to the distribution layer and out to the access layer, where we team up with another group that's called Field Services that does some of our hands and eyes on first level physical implementation. We work closely with a network architect that we have on that is closely aligned with our team. He has purview over both the university and the health system at this point. But we team together to make sure that we are defining this architecture and implementation as we go forward. So that includes our vast wireless deployment that we have on campus. Previously for me, as I said, this is my second go around with the Office of Information Technology. I've been in this role for just over 2 years. Previous to that, I spent 5 years at one of our graduate schools, which gave me the great experience of being able to work closely with faculty, students, and how they interact with an organization such as OIT. And prior to that, being the assistant dean there, I was within OIT in various roles for emergency communications, 800 megahertz radio paging, and that's kind of where my background began getting into Duke. So that's kind of a brief overview for what I am and what my team does currently today.
Hey, John, just to level set, is that the campus as well as the hospital, the medical center? Is that all inclusive?
So currently, we are responsible for the university side.
Okay.
We are their We do provide them, we're their ISP, if you will, that goes for us. And we are in a project right now where we will have a shared core that will be run by my team. That is
Okay.
something that we're engaged in. It's been a few years in the workings, and we are at the point now where equipment has arrived. We're developing our deployment strategies. It's still doing configurations and testing in the lab, and looking for probably end of calendar year where we start migrating, um, users' buildings over to the new core. With that said, the core will be our responsibility in conjunction with in the support of the health system, but they will still own their own wireless and everything from the user to their distribution that
Okay.
connects to our core.
Appreciate that. Yeah, go
That
ahead.
also means, so thank you for bringing that up, but we also are responsible for our China campus. So we set all the architecture, designs and support, or most of the support for our China campus, which obviously adds a level of intensity to our role. But that is we're going to be building out a core ideally with them that will mimic what we have on Duke's primary campus, just as a smaller scale because it's not the same size as our current university, but there's plenty of growth potential out there. So we're trying to build them for the future.
Wow, a lot of responsibility. So now we have a good sense of your role, your jurisdiction, the things that you care about as as we're coming out of this and COVID's on everybody's mind and hopefully it's in the rear view mirror. I just want to go back, from a past perspective, pre-COVID, things were normal. What were some of your priorities or your concerns as it related to wireless pre-pandemic?
So it's interesting. There's some things that from pre-pandemic that will carry over, I think, to post-pandemic. But I think that always the concern was, making sure from a back end that we are being consistent on our configs, right? We have multiple pairs of controllers. What do we do for failover? How we do redundancy? How we map that out through our campus, but also making sure that we're not caught by any measures of non-consistency in our configurations, right? So we're spending plenty of time post-COVID going through cleaning that up, making sure that we streamline that, because those configs were developed over time by various engineers. We wanted to make sure that we were heading into the future as clean as possible. Right, so that is from a back-end perspective and nothing seen from the end user customer perspective. Customer perspective, it was coverage, right? It's going to be coverage that continues to grow, right? So that as the demands for users and how they travel throughout campus and want to stay connected continues to grow, but also the devices continue to grow, right? How do we validate IoT devices, making sure that we're getting the proper testing in place and that we're meeting those needs of not only our students from IoT type devices, smart TVs and everything else, but then the expansion that's happening within research facilities before that, right? So pre-pandemic, it was how are we going to adjust for these? How do we make sure that we have the correct coverage, configs, or testing ability to make sure that we can take these devices on and meet the needs of the constituents? Or on the flip side of that, how do we handle possibly disappointing some of them?
Sure, sure.
To a better solution or work in conjunction with them.
So you bring up coverage is always king, right? Do I have the right coverage with the right technology? But as we pivot into the fall, right? We're in the summer, we've got the new semester, student staff, ideally back on campus full time. Any new priorities, any new concerns, given the way folks have lived for the past and studied for the past 15 months?
There are definitely concerns and battling currently how we're going to meet those concerns. Coverage is still king, as you stated, but now that coverage is almost every inch and corner of the campus. Individuals are used to being social distance at this point and taking their classes from wherever it may be. If it's a tent out in a quad, if it's from their dorm room, in a obscure office in the basement of some, location that we weren't aware of, right? All those areas are now becoming, will become more priority. And the expectation is that they'll have that seamless coverage, no matter where they are. And at what concern will that be when it gets to, when it gets to the aspects of, utilizing the video in all those portions, right? So, being able to take it outside, if you will, right? So we have people that wanted to, during the pandemic, well, we wanted to set up tents in the middle of the quad so we can have people outside and distance. But how do you get power there? Without power, you can't have AV, you can't have wireless, if it's far enough away from the building, how do we extend cables out that way? All that's possible, but it takes time, money, and we weren't being able to be as agile as we'd like to for that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you see, that's a great point. It's the distances, social distancing, this option to take classes wherever. What about new devices? Are you anything that you're seeing on the horizon as people come back, more devices, different devices? Because there is kind of a new norm, and I hate that word, but it's kind of overused.
Well, I think what we'll see is more devices, right? Because even with the social distancing aspect of it, it's put people in a sense in isolation, right? Not in the sense of you have COVID, you go in isolation, but in isolation from their peers. So that means to me that they're going to have more devices, right? So they can handle their connectivity to family members, to even peers on campus through video, but they may be, doing something else. If it's gaming consoles, which are always a big, a big need for students. But it's part of their social life. And that I think, has definitely increased. So those pressures of devices and bandwidth are going to continue to grow. But I don't think we've seen all those challenges yet, trying to anticipate what they are and what they're going to be. We're seeing some of the challenges from IoT devices and gaming consoles, and what impact is that going to have now, especially if they want those to be wireless.
Sure. Yeah. Great points. And I was going to, thinking about, and I'm not sure how relevant this is because everything's net new, right? People are coming back. There's new norms, if you would. But, if you could go back in time 15, 18 months and you foresaw this pandemic, which again, sounds absurd, would you have done anything differently, like proactively, if you could have envisioned this new norm?
I think some of it from an operational standpoint were things that are always in the back of our mind that we should have done, we could have done better, or that we should have implemented sooner. We had our standards and naming conventions and all that we were working towards. If we would have had that in place pre-pandemic, it would have helped us with mapping. It would have helped us with some of the analytics that we're doing with those teams. So then we were trying to play catch up, and we're still not there yet. So as simple as it may seem, but having mapping for those access points and being able to work with our analytics team to watch the flow of traffic, the gathering, or whatever it may be, would have been more helpful. But we were spending some time out in the field identifying those, and some of that comes through, just legacy workflows. Right, I'm going back. This is operational at this point, but we're not the ones always implementing, right? So we're relying on vendors, relying on our field services team. Sometimes it's even, intern student workers or contractors that are doing this. And we, on hindsight, if we had a better workflow process, it would have helped us. That minor input would have helped us with the maximum benefit of having those capabilities for analytics quicker, if you will.
Yeah.
Helped out a little bit sooner.
No, that's a great point, because like anything in life, right? How much time do you invest in preparing, right, for that unknown? And I guess the best lesson learned that I'm hearing is some of that work that tends to fall by the wayside, or you'll get to it, or there's always some other priority, could really be a gotcha.
Absolutely. Absolutely is. And it's, it's like hindsight. I realized the benefit, the extra benefit of that now, right? So now we're the benefit of working through that with, especially with our analytics team is, well, now we have that grouping or that cohesiveness with that unit that can help us post-pandemic, right? So now, not as much as the tracing or the gathering, but now it's okay. How does this help map our future deployments? As we're seeing, it's how can we work through this and more strategically go out and, look at what we're doing for refreshes and how we handle that. You talk about hindsight in 18 months ago, 2 years ago, you know, within that time, we were working on, okay, what is our next refresh going to look like? We made a large purchase, but it took us a while to roll out, right? Well, could we have drawn a line in the sand differently at that point? Or could we have approached it um, using the analytics a little bit more to say, okay, we want to focus on these areas instead of just this model, right? And try to transition that differently. So then we are getting newer the newer technologies out there for the high traffic areas instead of the traditional rudimentary way of saying, okay, this is becoming end of life. Let's focus on this area. And you have to balance that business wise with making sure that you're not throwing good money after bad, right? So how do you do that with manpower? How do you do that with purchases? But making that happen, I think would have also helped us as we come into this post-pandemic view.
Hey, before we get into some of the juicy stuff like 5G, Wi-Fi 6, private LTE, you've mentioned analytics a couple times. Obviously, that's key to understanding the business, the state of the state. Give me a sense of the depth of those analytics. Like, what are you doing? What are some of your inputs? And how do you use some of that information? And would you do more if you could?
I think we're at the do more if we could at this point, right? So again, we're, that team throughout this period of time has been overwhelmed, right? And you've seen, if you look at investment in personnel, that's an area that you see investment in because they needed that analytics because they were so overwhelmed they had to grow that team. So we're still, I feel, on the cusp of that, right? And using that. At that point, we were using it for contact tracing or, pinpointing high concentration that shouldn't be occurring, right, during the pandemic. But then, we can use that now for, okay, understanding traffic patterns. Where are people flowing through the most? Is there a gap? Do we see a gap in that coverage as people are going or transitioning on areas on campus?
Mhm.
Right. So that is one of the key areas. Because as going to my point earlier, everybody wants every inch of the campus covered. Not realistic at this point in time, right? But so you put all of your emphasis on the areas that we know are going to be utilized.
Yep. No, thank you. And it's like being prepared, having real-time data obviously makes you capable of making better decisions.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So again, here's the, everybody's talking about, at least in the circles that I'm running in, and I'm sure you are, is, Wi-Fi 6, private LTE, 5G from carriers, DAS systems, and you talked about one of the key things is coverage. So how do you figure all that out, John? And tell us a little bit about what Duke has done and is thinking about doing.
So figuring that out, I think is, still a work in progress, right? For many, I don't know, many of my peers are in the same situation I am, but we have recently put when I say recent, in the last few years, put a big investment into upgrades in our wireless infrastructure. Not just access points, but back end and making that investment. So when is the transition time? Or is it a transition? Is it a augmentation, right? How do they handle each other when you talk about these other technologies? Because you can see the benefits of all those technologies you talked about, especially with 5G, CBRS, private LTE, whatever you want to call it, where we can get to that more towards that coverage need that everybody has. But what is the path of deployment for that, right? If you're, going back to my example where somebody's in the middle of a quad where no Wi-Fi signal is going to reach, but that's where they want to hold class. Can you use something like a private LTE to extend that, to extend it out there to them? But it's, making sure that our investment that we have in today is not going to be diminished, but making sure that we're making the steps going forwards that are incorporating these new technologies. So I think that's where we're at now. And what Duke is doing, we're taking the time now to kick the tires on it. Right, we're taking the time now to look at, with pilots for 5G, how can we, set ourselves up with PBRS. We know that we're not going to get we're not going to be with the big players and being able to purchase that, but can we squat on some of that space? Right? Can we acquire some of that through that realm, and utilize that for augmentation on our campus, or is there another vended solution that we partner with to go forward? To make that offset happen. But I see, if you look at use cases that can, if I take a student through a day, right, they want coverage in their dorm. So we have that today, but then they walk outside and they walk to the bus stop. They want to stay connected throughout all that. When they're on their bus, they want to stay connected, right? And that connection, when I say, we have that capability, if it's through our DAS, if it's through just macro sites, if it's through Wi-Fi, that may all exist today, but it's not seamless, right? Because it's not all the Duke network. Can we make that all the Duke network through all those stages? So from dorm to classroom, they're covered. But then that question, the pandemic has also raised further question with that, because, well, now we have students staying in offsite non-Duke locations, a high concentration. How do we extend it there? Right? Does that get into a partnership with community? Right? And how do we make make everybody happy? Which is not a very easy job to do and not a place you always want to find yourself in. How can we make it, how can we get to something that is more continuous for them as much as possible? And I think those technologies can bring us to that point.
Yeah, that's good. So, and what about just playing on that? There's this notion of CBRS and private LTE. What's been your experience with, the major cellular carriers and coverage on campus, and just from a relationship standpoint, how do you handle those relationships? Is it a partnership? Is it antagonistic? Just some thoughts on that.
It's been a good partnership. So going back in my history a little bit. So when we first started to deploy DAS on campus, I was involved in that project. Then I've taken some years away from that, and now it sits through those relationships with one of my peers. But I can tell you, like, what we have on campus, we have a, carrier agnostic, if you will. We have three main carriers that we deal with. They all partner with us on our DAS. And so we have a pretty prolific system in place on campus today. So providing coverage. And that we do also for the health system. So when we talked about networking primary before, the DAS and cellular is a different augmentation. And that does cover both entities for this. But that partnership we have levied against, levied those carriers to help participate in that DAS setup. So that has made the relationships beneficial to both parties.
No, that's great. Thinking, you mentioned, potential trials with private LTE, CBRS. From your experience, from what what are some of the key things that you'll be focused on above and beyond the obvious coverage and cost to figure out if that's going to be the right fit? Like, what are some of those key decision criteria, in your opinion?
So solving problems that may or may not exist today, right? So if you look at problems that we may encounter today that we need to, that this would definitely help us or benefit it is security cameras, right? They continuous growth on those, because we want to make sure that our students, staff, faculty are all protected. So, but deploying those in certain areas today that we traditionally cannot get to, right? How does this help us with that? But there's also, researchers that are focusing on, large data sets that are coming off, out in these different areas. Prime example, we have a marine facility, right? They have a vessel that goes out offshore, way offshore at times, and collecting a bunch of data. When they bring that back, they need to offload that data to their systems. So how do we, if we're able to start doing that a little bit further offshore, they can start getting that data down, and then while it's docked at that facility, it's pulling off wirelessly, at a high rate, high speed, because you're talking, if they're out there listening to whale sounds, that's a lot of audio that they're collecting over a course of a week, and being able to offload that as quickly as possible, so then they can turn around and move that into, move that into their research. And that gets into, not my area of expertise, but that gets into some edge computing things that you hear about, especially with IoT devices, where they're crunching all that at that point and just transporting over the important data back in.
You may want to level set when people think of offshore in Durham, North Carolina. This is your campus on the coast.
Yes, yes. We do have a campus in Beaufort, North Carolina. There are some people that I think are joined the webinar that are familiar with that area.
There you go.
But that is our Duke Marine Lab, which is another small campus that we support.
Yeah, not where they play basketball, where they do research.
Yes. Very true.
So as you, again, wireless, we talked about this webinar about the past, the present, the future. As you look 12, 24 months, 36 months out, and you've got new devices, virtual reality, augmented reality, like how do you keep it all? I mean, how are you going to keep all that together and manage this various infrastructure? Is it more analytics? Is it more resources? Is it a partnership? And again, nothing's in stone, but what are you thinking?
I think it's all of those. And I think the last one that you stated as partnership is a key thing that I've been trying to drive, from my position to my peers, if it's in research computing, if it's faculty, the different various graduate schools, leveraging those relationships to understand where they're going. Because you talk about post-pandemic challenges or needs, right? It is understanding what the new educational environment's going to be, right? You talk about virtual reality or augmented reality, how's that going to be impacted in the classroom? What is that going to mean? And then going back to space again, where is that going to be conducted, right? Because it's non-traditional space that is now being utilized, that will become then the new traditional space.
Yeah.
But it's having that partnership and understanding, and we have some insight. We see some of the roadmaps to that. So for us to start preparing for that, goes back to what we do internally, right? How do we prepare ourselves to taking those lessons learned, as I talked about previously, preparing our operational needs. It's continuing to do that. As I said, we're in the process now of implementing a new core. So we'll have a 100 gig core, right? So we're going to be able to handle what we see for the foreseeable future. But then how do we handle that out at our edge more so? And what does that mean, and what does that impact? So it is partnering with those individuals to see what they're going to be doing next, instead of what we've continually found ourselves in is being reactive to what they've already bought, purchased, and implemented.
Right.
So can we be part of that process going forward. We're helping you evaluate. And that means we need to be available to them. And we need to make sure that we're engaged with them. And we have some working groups on campus that help us with that. And all that, as you're talking about these different needs and all that, is how does it fit into our network? But it's also, how do we approach that from a segmentation standpoint, from a security standpoint, and with these new technologies, how do they fit into what we're trying to do for that posture?
So you bring, going 100 gig core, collaborating with the various organizations, probably one of the big challenges, how do you forecast demand, right? Number of devices, bandwidth. What are some thoughts? How do you make the right decisions today? So, 3-5 years from now, you've got the infrastructure in place, or you can modify the infrastructure.
Right. So we do, going back to our analytics group, there's another portion of that team that does some of our metrics for us, right? So we sit down on a routine basis and review metrics. We watch the trends, the patterns, and how they're being impacted. How many devices are hitting our visitor network? How many devices, do we see overall on our network using various SSIDs? Which ones are being used more heavily? What are the reports showing from bandwidth utilization out of distributions or buildings, or where that may be? What do our research buildings look like, and how are they reacting to that? We've prepared in our implementation from a distribution standpoint of where we can see growth from where we are today with an optic change, ideally. Right? So we can incorporate what's next. So having that vision, and our network architect, who I mentioned early on in this call, has done a great job of seeing that vision. And now that he sits over both the clinical area and the university side, it's helping us continue to shape that. From his vision, where he's seeing things are growing from our metrics, what we're seeing real day today, and being able to trend that going forwards.
So just a nugget here is, you talk about devices, students in different areas, pop-up classrooms, audio visual. What research, what about, vehicles, IoT type centric use cases, buses or kiosks or parking gates, yada, yada, yada.
Right. So we handle our parking gates today and the traditional setup, right? But that requires, that requires fiber and everything else going out there. And Duke loves its parking. So we are going, how do we change that? How do we look forward and utilizing some of their, some of the growth maybe within those in that vertical from that vendor, and is there a way that we can transition into to wireless? And then we'd have to prove out that the stability of the wireless aspect of that, right? And can that file into private LTE, CBRS, 5G, whatever it may be? Ideally, that's the way to go, because then your implementation strategy is a little bit cleaner.
Right.
But there are other IoT devices from researchers. There's drones, right? We have drone that collect a bunch of data, and it would be nice to have that real-time data going directly to, if it's a class of PhD students, or if it's true research that they're doing, from an architectural standpoint, doing 3D mapping, real 3D mapping of a building as it is today, so they can take and turn that into what renovation would look like. And using drones to be able to provide that footage.
Interesting. Yep.
So there's different aspects of that are continuing to be built upon, and these are all pieces going back into what we said before about partnerships that need to occur to make sure that we are we don't want to hold them back from their goals. We want to be partners in making sure that they're attaining their goals. And that's a change in mindset from 5 years ago.
Yep. Without putting words in your mouth, it sounds like, as you look out over the future, and coverage is king, I'm sure security plays a role in that, supporting, and love to hear some commentary on that, but it sounds like you see potentially several different technologies that you can kind of interplay and leverage that gives you the best cost, best coverage, best security, best flexibility to cover students, faculty, staff, researcher, etc. So it's not one size fits all. It's a combination.
That's how I see it today. We're talking future, and it's always trouble when you start talking future because people say, well, back on June, whatever day we're at, 17th, John said this. Well,
Right.
trying to see this as it grows and goes through. But you're right, it's not one size fits all. So, from a support standpoint, when you're fixing that, is what can we do in our traditional legacy way of doing things? How do we streamline that to turn that to a commodity-based solution where then we can focus our talents, time, and energy into these other technologies to really bring us forward, right? So going back, 20 minutes ago in our conversation, we were talking about what we did in the past and what we could have sped up is configurations, making sure that they're standard and all that. Well, how do we make those so streamlined? How do we make our architecture so streamlined that truly is take one off the shelf, put it back in, it gets its configuration and it's on its way. So
Right.
then my high level engineers can focus on the interconnects of CBRF to our environment and how we're making sure that the whale audio files are being bought in seamlessly for the class that's getting ready conducted in one of our facilities that's 3 hours away.
Interesting. What about, so again, before, I'm just mindful of time and there might be some questions, but John, Duke's a big campus and I'm sure you have a lot of interactions with the town, the community.
Yes.
When you look at wireless and what you're doing on campus, how involved is Duke in covering some of off campus or, the main strip? Just give me a sense of your relationship with the community and conversations you've had or maybe having.
So we've, interesting point to bring up, Mike, because we have had, since the beginning of the pandemic, we've engaged with the city of Durham to help them address needs for underprivileged, underserved communities, right? So working with them on a project with the Durham Housing Authority to come up with ways where they can help bring wireless coverage to students of need that still, need to go to class but could not go to the classroom, that may have been technology challenged, or needed just that quiet space at their home to be able to work and get that wireless coverage that's necessary so they can get into the community or get into the school district's sites and teaching. So we've worked pretty heavily on design with them, partnering with them on what we think will bring the best partnership between the community, the city, Duke, and the schools. So that's been a very interesting and worthwhile project. It's still one in process, but it's something that I think will live beyond what we feel is the pandemic, because now these individuals will have greater access to what they need for learning. Teachers will have more of an opportunity to reach them, and the community as a whole should be able to benefit from that.
Oh, that's great. I mean, I know in my travels, campuses are big deals in the cities and the towns, and they have an impact. And it's great to hear that you're reaching out and helping the community and students that need access, because broadband is that critical utility, and I think we've all figured that out. John, I'm going to pivot. And again, I love the perspective, but I'm just going to take an opportunity there is a question I'd love you to respond to is, when you implement wireless, do you complete a wireless survey in all instances? And if not, when do you use a survey and when not?
All right, so let's answer that through the hindsight, right?
There you
go. We should have been doing more surveys in the past, right? So you talk about things, and I didn't answer this previously, but when we were pre-pandemic and things we were working towards, it was working our way out of some deployments that were done without tools or without surveys, that were done more on the fly, if you will. So our, what I'll call my lead wireless engineer, my wireless guru, we've spent a lot of time the past few years, 3 years, working on how we better survey, better implementation strategy for that. So, we try to do with any new building, we're doing a layout with tools that says, here's the building makeup, here's what the predictive map is telling us. So then we could create that budgetary quote, and then we can also kind of start laying out, or we lay out what we envision the implementation to be, right? Then as things are constructed, we spend time in the field with, we have a project manager that does all of our new construction sites or renovation sites. We spend time in the field with them, making sure that, what was on paper is actual, or, did they put a metal duct right where we were going, right next to where we were going to put an access point? What kind of field adjustments do we have to make? And trying to work with our field services team to have that same understanding, that same feel, that same vision. So getting them to utilize those tools or the output of those tools to make those field adjustments is been beneficial in recent projects and will continue to be beneficial going forwards. But to answer your question, I think as much as possible, we want to try and do those surveys. Now, if it's, let's say, a small building, one floor, one, open space, we don't really need to spend the time doing a tool survey. You can visualize that. But if you're doing a multi-tenant space, absolutely. If you are, anytime that we have the opportunity to do renovation, we are trying to get in as much as possible to redefine what the wireless network looks like, because the swap out replace of APs over the past dozen years needs the same, our footprint that we had. Is that the right RF footprint for today? Probably not. Things have changed, technologies have changed, and renovations will make those changes.
No, that's interesting. So, just kind of the big rocks of this conversation, I really appreciate your input. Is some of the notes I took is, coverage is king, right? I mean, more coverage is better. I think you really hit home on the preparedness, kind of that lessons learned, and the more prepared you are, the more quickly you can respond. I think analytics, just in my experience, sometimes overlooked, is so critical to help you from a planning perspective and understanding kind of that user experience. And the other thing that really resonated with me was the kind of the cross communication, all the various organizations collaborating, understanding, what's important to you, what's important to them, what are they doing, how does it impact your work? And then the last note I took was this, this notion of pilots. You need to test this stuff to see how it will fit in, because, as you said, it's probably a multi-wireless strategy. So is there anything else in that portfolio that jumps out at you? I know we touched a little on security, but I don't want to overlook that because that's top of mind as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, security is always top of mind. And that touched on a little bit with what we're talking about with segmentation, right? That's a portion of it too, to make sure, if you talk about IoT devices, how do we onboard IoT devices to make sure they're segmented out and protects us from a, not only an ease of onboarding, but also it protects us from, any security concerns with that. But you talk about the partnerships and the impacts, right? There's things that are still on the horizon for us that, we're continuing to work through, right? If you look at partners with our voice team, right? That, that's a different director that is one of my peers. What do we do for QoS? What are we doing for QoS on voice on that? Because as, more and more that's going to become wireless, right? And our partners over in the health system are battling that now. How do we help them through that? The same thing is going to be, probably most QoS type policies, if it's for clinical devices, if it's for video, which will be, which was being used previously, pre-pandemic, and now it's heavily used, and we don't see that going away. And it's making sure that that quality of service is existing for that portion, because that is an impact to the teaching environment. So it's partnering all the way across all of that to make sure that we're hitting those marks.
That's interesting. John, there is another quick question here from the audience is, can you speak a bit about Wi-Fi identity services and how Duke onboards Wi-Fi clients?
So, as mentioned with segmentation, we are working towards this ability now for being able to identify devices as they're being, if it's being registered through our Duke Open, right? So we have multiple SSIDs, right? So one of them is our secure SSID, which is Duke Blue, which takes the individual's identity, and they have to make sure that they're authenticating against that. But for IoT devices, John Robinson can go in here and say, okay, I want to register my whatever IoT device on the network. And once it's registered, it will automatically drop it into the correct segment for our network. And ideally, that is being identified through the back end, so that you just says, okay, yep, John Robinson knows his device. This is what it's going to be used for, and it goes into the proper network. Because some of the devices can't handle the authentication that is necessary. But then it's also looking at that, and this is also future speaking, John Robinson is an identity that we know, we understand from Duke campus, but this device, when it's his, constantly hits the visitor network, right? So how do we work with John to make sure we transition that to the correct network? I don't know if that answers your question fully, but that's a portion of it.
Sure. I'm just, John, again, this has been great for me, that past pre-COVID. I'm sure there's a much longer past than the last 18 months, but the present, this fall, the future, the different technologies that you guys are dealing with. Steve, I'm assuming, do we want to open it up to questions, or maybe John gives some final comments? Let me know what you're thinking.
Yeah, we can open up the floor to some additional questions. We have about 13 minutes or so. So, in the meantime, while we wait for questions, you can give some final thoughts, John, while we wait for those questions to come in.
So final thoughts, huh? I think that as much as we talk about, I talked a lot operationally about what we do. There is a lot of exciting things that I think the new technology brings. And having the opportunity today to pilot these, to test these things, is exciting to not just me, but to my team, because it's bringing something where they're helping to shape what the future can be for the university. And if we secure those partnerships, if we have more involvement in what they're doing out in the field, it excites to make sure that we're making those correct decisions, and it gives us the feedback that we need to make sure we're navigating properly. I don't want to find us in a course of action where we're saying, hey, this is the best thing ever, and this is the direction we're going to go, and then it falls flat. So having those partnerships and that vision, and really having a partnership with our health system is also definitely helping us. It is very exciting, but also you see the creative opportunities that can come with this. And we've heard, and I'm sure my peers on the call have heard, wireless first campus, right? That's the vision. That's where everybody wants to be. That's for the, making sure that we're hitting all those marks. So it is, you're not going to be able to go back 10 years and say, well, it's a coverage challenge. No, now it's what can we do and for you, and how can we make your life better through wireless technologies?
John, another question. Actually, there are two that popped up. I'll hit you with the first one. How do you have, the topic of campus bandwidth and resources within higher ed? as you move forward in a post-pandemic dual teaching modality. You talked a little bit about upgrading the core. Any more comments about more bandwidth?
Well, so in the beginning of the pandemic, we found ourselves in a very fortunate situation. So before everybody started work from home, we upgraded our edge with our provider. So we're at dual connected 100 gig connections. So that enabled to make sure that we are meeting the needs on and off campus for people that are, traversing back into campus. We also worked closely with our partner and making sure that we had enough, VPN connections and we can handle the load or onslaught of load, which we did very well with that. So we found ourselves in a pretty fortunate situation with that. Now, the flip side of it is that we also spent a lot of time, support time, with users working from home where their connection was not what was needed, right? Or their connection was providing the challenges, and trying to get some individuals across campus that are not as in tune with what the technology is or what it does for them, provided some difficulties because you wanted to make sure that you were paying attention to them having to transition to a new environment. So there was some anxiety that individuals were having to perform their job while they're working from home with kids in the backgrounds and dogs running through, that we were trying to help them as much as possible understand what they needed to do from a work from home environment. So as secure and confident we felt in our network and what we were offering people, trying to look at it from their perspective, provided some hurdles that we had to work with teams to get through. But we provided, one of our teams created a, speed test that was Duke specific. So we held some early briefings and calls to encourage people to find that and do their test results so they can help self-identify.
Very cool. Johnny, I got another question for you. Pretty straightforward. Describe how you acquire equipment from a reseller, and do you have a preferred supplier? And when you do these things, is it typical practice to get multiple quotes?
So we have a primary preferred vendor that we work with closely, and we have two resellers that we deal with that provide our we have one that I consider primary and one secondary, and try to leverage them. Do we try to get multiple quotes? Yes. We want to make sure, as much as I enjoy the partnerships and relying on my vendors for that, I have to be cost conscious and I have to make sure that I'm making correct business decisions.
Yeah, that's important. It's at the end of the day, right? It's about relationships too. Who works with you and you trust and can service your needs, good times and bad.
That is correct.
Got another question. How do you see the on-campus, near-campus environment? I think we touched a little bit about this with the Durham, as a working lab for wireless support for IoT or smart campus type services. So, that kind of perimeter or those adjacencies. With some comments on that.
My first comment would probably be underutilized at this point. But that is a growing area that we need to spend a little bit more time focusing on. One of the things that I mentioned previously was the students living in offsite campuses that Duke leases, right? So they're not Duke buildings, but they had to, for the separation of students, they had to find opportunities within the community to house these students. So that is one area that, we've been able to review, but we haven't spent enough time on what that means from a support standpoint, overall. So I would say at this point it's underutilized. Now, from a working lab perspective, internally we have a pretty prolific lab environment that is ever growing, and we try to use our main office location, which is, a lease space off campus, as our secondary lab. So whenever we deploy, we went through this a few years ago. Our concept of deployment is testing in the lab, configuration, make sure it all works there, testing at our location, to make sure that we eat our own dog food, so to speak. And then we have a test dorm that during non-COVID times, we use that dorm and the student input to make sure that what we're rolling out is correct. So that's kind of our process, and then we get to the deployment on major campus.
Awesome. I'm gonna hit you with one more question, and then I'll thank you for your time and wisdom here. So, forgive me, didn't want to do that. When you're viewing the tasks and operation of the network, which areas are considered mission critical versus those that may be better served through a vendor partnership?
So how far expand do we want to do this from a network? So from a network perspective, the criticalness of it is going to be dependent upon when students are in session, right? Because that has an impact. But our data centers, our research facilities, the classroom environment are all critical. Then you get obviously into the health system, and everything that you almost touch over there is going to be a critical environment. And we, from a university perspective, try to make sure that we're mapping all that in-house. If I go back to what we've talked about previously about streamlining and automation, try to make that as seamless as possible. That is our goal, so we can continue to handle that in-house. Vendor partnerships, maybe some deployments that we do from access points, we can leverage that. But if you get into the DAS situation, that's where kind of more from we're looking from a vendor management standpoint, if we're talking about that type of technology going into this for wireless, where we can leverage those partners and adjusting those areas. Although the equipment may be, open, if you will, for multiple carriers, we rely heavily on that partnership and those vendors to make sure that that is working optimally.
Hey, that's John. Listen, I want to be mindful of your time because you stepped up through a perfect game, if you ask me, right out of the bullpen. On behalf of Cisco and University Business, I really do appreciate your time, your input. Stephen, I'm going to turn it back to you to wrap things up.
Definitely. Thank you. And again, I'm just echoing those sentiments. So thanks again, John, for coming in at the last second. We really do appreciate it, and our audience as well. And with that, I would also like to thank our attendees for joining us here today. For those of you who enjoyed our presentation, there are many more like these coming up that are provided by University Business, which is the leader in editorial coverage of news, as well as trends and current issues in higher education. Our wide range of readers subscribe for free at UB and stay up to date with this through our print magazine, as well as the digital edition, our newsletters, including UB Daily, which is our daily newsletter, as well as web seminars like this one. And for those of you who would like to watch this web seminar again, or some of you might believe that the solutions provided would be really helpful to your colleagues, you'll be pleased to know that an archive recording of this web seminar will be available at the URL that you can see on your screen here. And you can also expect to receive an email from our team at some point tomorrow at UB that will provide a link to the on-demand video. So look out for that. So with that, on behalf of UB, this is Stephen Blackburn. Thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your summer. Take care, be well, and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. See you, Johnny.
Thank you. I appreciate it all.
You bet.